Hey everybody, my name is Ben Brigida and I'm Director of SOC Operations, specifically the MDR at Expel.
And I'm Steve Edwards, Director of Detection and Response.
And today we're here to talk to you about the quarterly threat report for Q2. So this is something that Expel puts together every quarter, focused on the recent trends that we've seen and what we've done about them, and actions that you can take to make your organizations more secure. So this is a quick overview of the agenda that we're going to run through. First, we're going to start with the numbers, the top threats, and the numbers associated with them. Then we're going to talk about specific instances with identity threat trends, malware, phishing, and then every quarter we ended with a quarterly spotlight, something that we found interesting that we want to share. So again, quick overview of the QTR. How do we generate this? Well, the SOC leadership team, that includes our detection and response team and our analyst teams, get together and with some analysts and pull some data and analyze it and put together the things that we're seeing. This is specifically from Q2 in 2023, but we are comparing it to past quarters. So at Expel, we have customers of all sizes, in the tens up to the 50,000 endpoints, 100,000 endpoints plus, large and small. So we're able to see that across all verticals and in different stages of maturity. So we get a good sample of what's happening at different areas. And what we want to talk about today is not just what we saw in those specific categories, but what we did to investigate and detect them, and then how you can remediate them in the future and prevent them or mitigate them. So the goal is to translate the things that we're seeing across a wide customer base into specific actionable things for you to do at most likely a smaller total endpoint size. So high level, the threats that we saw are the same that we've seen in recent history. The top 4 vectors for an attack that we saw succeed are account compromise, commodity malware, account takeover, and phishing. One thing that I want to call out, what's the difference between account compromise and account takeover? This is something where account compromise is when the credentials are actually accurate. So the attacker has stolen the credentials from someone, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to access the account. That means that it's mitigated by some other vector through MFA or through other avenues in order to prevent them from logging in or detect it before they're able to take actions on target and complete the mission. Account takeover is when they're actually able to complete the mission there, or get closer to complete the mission and taking steps on the target, things like creating inbox rules or attempting to phish other folks. So we want to identify stuff as early as possible in the life cycle, as I'm sure you do as well. So we want to put the focus on account compromise here, but account takeover is later stage SaaS application compromise. All right. So this is an example of a graph that we pulled from the QTR. If you haven't checked it out, I strongly recommend you go check it out, and you can see here, but this is just highlighting all the different incident types that we saw in Q2. So Steve, that's the high level stuff. Do you mind explaining to us some of the more specifics about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a closer look here. So the top trend that we saw, as you mentioned, Ben, was 64% of the incidents that we looked at were identity-based attacks. And that should come as no surprise to anyone in the industry. It grew by 7% since Q1, but for over a decade, we've been saying that identity is the new perimeter. It is the front door to everything in the business. And so it makes sense that our attackers are focusing on that. If we look inside that number, about 56% of the incidents that we saw in Q2 were account compromise or account takeover in Microsoft 365. That's not an indictment of their security. That's actually because of their prevalence. And 365 is so common that is where the attackers are taking the attacks. Beyond that, we have seen the deployment of commodity malware and pre-ransomware family malware. That was at 23% of the incidents that we saw over Q2. Looking at some of the smaller trends that we saw 8% of our incidents come from identity providers like Duo, Okta, and OneLogin. That's where we were able to find those identity compromises. And long-lived access tokens, small percent of the incidents that we've seen, only 2%, but that is up by double from 1% from Q1. And this was across both AWS and GCP. And finally, only 1% of the attacks that we saw, the incidents that we investigated, were from advanced persistent threats, APTs. And that shows that that's consistent with previous quarters as well. And that shows that while they are out there, that is probably not where you should focus most of your effort when building a security program. So let's dig in a little further to the identity threat trends that we saw this quarter. We saw growth in session cookie theft via adversary-in-the-middle attacks. Ben, can you take us through that?
Absolutely. So about a year ago, Microsoft moved towards a more secure by default posture where they disabled basic auth. And this was a thing that attackers were abusing. Basic auth was a way for them to bypass multi-factor authentication. And so we had seen a lot of attacks going that way. And we've talked about MFAs and the silver bullet because attackers can bypass and things like that. Microsoft took the necessary step of being more secure by default, and the attackers evolved. The tale as old as time. This is something we see all the time. And what we've seen since that was implemented is a large increase in session cookie theft using adversary-in-the-middle attacks. So once upon a time, they would just try and steal the credentials, not try and proxy your MFA request through attacker-controlled infrastructure, and then actually steal that session cookie. So this is something, of all the stuff we're going to talk about today, this is something that you need to be on the lookout for, because the session cookie will contain things such as indicating that it's from a managed asset. And that is risky because a lot of people will actually just tune out any login from a managed asset. There's a positive here, though, in that the attackers do not have persistent access most of the time past that keep me logged in period. And they'll actually create another thing that we can detect, which is registering a new MFA device, which is not something we commonly see across the environment. So there's a good detection opportunity here. But Steve, can you talk to us about how we resolved it and how we enabled our team to protect the customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So we built new detections to identify attacker-in-the-middle techniques. And that's something that has historically been hard for the industry at large to detect because there isn't a lot of logging around it. If someone's already logged in, there isn't a lot of telemetry around their login attempt. So that can be tricky. And so we looked at a few behavioral detections surrounding several logins in a short amount of time, and some behaviors that we see, like you mentioned, Ben, adding a new MFA device to gain persistence afterwards. In addition, we built some improved information displays for our own analysts in Expel Workbench to better enhance their investigations when they are looking at these alerts, to better understand this style of attack and be able to respond effectively.
That's great. Can you explain to the folks how they can help protect their organizations from this?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, you should have strong authentication, strong multi-factor authentication, either certificate-based or FIDO WebAuthn U2F style tokens that are hard to phish. But like we said, that's not a silver bullet. So we should also be inspecting those logs for new MFA devices added. It's not a common event for end users. Probably once a year when Apple releases their new iPhone, you're going to get a lot of them, and that's okay. Normally, it's a rare event, and so it's worth inspecting because we know it is tied to attacker behavior, especially with attacker-in-the-middles. It's also worth looking at how long your session timeout has to be. It's one of those trade-offs between usability and security. But with this emerging threat, it's probably worth turning down that time a bit. If you've got a 30-day session on some of your business tools, maybe it only needs to be 1 day. And it's okay if folks have to log in again tomorrow. All right, let's move on from there to malware trends, both pre-ransomware and commodity malware risks. Ben, can you take us through what we saw last quarter?
Absolutely. So this is going to sound familiar. Microsoft moved towards more secure by default by disabling macros in docs by default downloaded from the internet, and so the attackers evolved. one of the things that we've seen happen now is more malicious JavaScript, link files, and HTA files being downloaded and used as the initial compromise vector. We're also seeing a lot of this come from watering hole attacks, or basically, on a forum somewhere, they have a compressed file containing a JavaScript, and they say, hey, download this prenup agreement, and then when you access it, it has one of these instead. And another trend that we've seen on the malware front, which is, it's hard to even call it malware, to be honest, but it's software that's being used maliciously, is an abuse of legitimate remote access tools as part of the support scams. So Steve, can you talk to us about how we resolved that stuff and investigated it?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the malicious JavaScript, link, and HTA files, we work to improve our detection logic around these specifically to fine-tune what we're looking for, to filter through the noise and find the signs of malware, so that our analysts could respond quickly and effectively to catch and help contain that. And we identified more recommendations for resilience actions to prevent these types of attacks from actually getting a foothold in your network.
Can you talk to us about the types of resilience recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the easiest things that you could do is in Active Directory or Group Policy Orchestrator, just make it so that you can't double click on JavaScript files and HTA files and have them execute code. I can't imagine a lot of business cases where that's necessary broadly across your business, where you really want every single user in your organization to double click on JavaScript and have it execute. Just assign those to Open and Notepad, and you'll be years ahead of where people are at right now. The other problem, Ben, that you mentioned is a little bit trickier. Like you said, it's hard to call it a malware threat because these are legitimate remote access tools, and that means that your EDR probably isn't going to bubble up signal for you by default if someone ran GoToMeeting or GoToMyPC or PC Anywhere or any of these kinds of tools. But this is where communication is key. Work with your IT team and your business systems teams to see what tools do we need and what ones can we establish a block list for. Windows has App Locker built in, where you can actually block binaries right at the file system or at the Explorer level, so that you can start to establish this list of, yeah, we do use GoToMeeting sometimes, but we're never going to use PC Anywhere here. So that's okay to block. And then if someone does need it, they can open an IT ticket or something first. I think that's the right preventative measures here, because there's not really much else out in the industry right now to prevent these types of attacks, which often start out of channel through text messages or malicious advertisements or phishing emails to personal accounts, even though they usually do end up on corporate networks. Let's move on now to phishing threat trends that we've seen. A high percentage of the emails that are flagged to our phishing team as potential phishes turn out to be benign. But Ben, can you take us through what we've seen?
Absolutely. So our phishing service takes user-submitted phishing emails and attempts to answer 3 questions. And that is going to be, is the email malicious? Did anyone else get this? Which are basically table stakes for the industry at this point. And then, was anyone compromised? And that is really the crux of the issue, right? Receiving a malicious email is one thing, but actually having a user submit credentials or download and execute a malicious file is where action on the defender side needs to take place and the user's actually been compromised. And what we found is about 20% of the emails that users submit are malicious, which is a pretty good, they're doing a pretty good job of identifying those. And as we scope to see who else got the email, only about 0.04%, very small percent of the total malicious submissions wind up resulting in a compromise, not from the person who submitted it, but from other folks who received it in the organization and didn't submit it, fell for the trick. So that 4.04% seems like a small number, but a small percentage of a very large number is still a large number. And our target is 0 compromises, 0 successful compromises. So it still represents risk in the industry or for your organization. So Steve, can you talk about how we helped our team resolve these at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like you said, the majority of the submissions that we get are benign. They're not phishing. They won't result in compromise. And so we've been continuing to build automation, leveraging machine learning to help filter out those benign submissions to save analysts time so that can free up their cycles to work on remediating the instances where it is malicious and to spending the time doing that tricky problem, that third goal that we have, which is finding out if someone was compromised, running that down. So we're creating that space in the phishing team to be able to go through and do those exact things.
Awesome. And then can you talk about what orgs should do to protect themselves from these attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. So continue with training for teaching employees what phishing is. And that's not a silver bullet. We're never going to train away the phishing risk. Phishing training is important because it teaches people what to do when they receive a phishing email. Ben, like you said, the folks who are compromised aren't the ones who are reporting it. So it's a really important team effort that I think the end users don't even realize they're being a part of. When they submit that phishing email, it helps us find who did fall for it. Because if you fell for it, you're not going to report it to us as phishing. You didn't think it was phishing. So we'll continue to encourage caution, but encourage reporting as well. And then we really need to create safe ways for our end users to fail. That means that when we do get credential harvesting phishing, that's backstopped by adaptive authentication, strong multi-factor authentication. When email attachments are sent through, our security email gateway can catch that first. Things like that. So really investing in a way for humans to be able to make human errors, because we always will, all of us. So investing in those things gives our team a way to fail safely. So now, Ben, let's look at the quarterly spotlight this quarter. So like you said, every quarter we like to take a look at something interesting that we saw in the trends that's different from previous quarters. And this year we have an interesting dichotomy, a very new vulnerability and a very old vulnerability, both resulting in server-side exploit incidents in Q2. So Ben, take us through a tale of two vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. So for the folks in the security industry, which is everybody listening to this, we're all intimately familiar with the MOVEit 0 day that came in Q2. I'm sure it ruined many folks' weekends. What we found when we examined our incidents and looked for root cause, ones that had a vulnerability that was exploited, the number one was MOVEit for our customer list. And number two, right behind it, in line with it, was a decade-old exploit. And this stood out to us, right? Because the thing that got all the news this year was the 0 day. And the thing that was just as effective at compromising our customer base was something that was 10 years old, or older than 10 years, actually. So it's interesting how the things that are newsworthy are the new scary. But a lot of times the thing that actually helps move the needle for most people is going to be the older things. I think we all know this in the security industry, and there's a lot of complexity here for why these things can't get patched. But it's interesting to see that the CISOs probably asked about MOVEit, and they probably didn't ask about the decade-old vulnerability. So can you talk to us, Steve, a bit about what we did for both of these?
Yeah, absolutely. With the MOVEit vulnerability, we heard about it as the news was breaking that it existed. And so we worked very rapidly to identify which of our customers were using MOVEit and which ones were impacted by this vulnerability through exploits. We ran down to understand the entire scope and impact of those incidents and helped our customers resolve quickly. Earlier this year, we also built and released a new product for vulnerability prioritization. Because Ben, like you said, businesses just can't always remediate every single vulnerability. So our goal at Expel has always been to create space for our customers to do the things that they need to do. And that's what we're trying to do here as well with vulnerability prioritization, is give our customers a roadmap of where to go first, where to apply their engineering or IT effort, or perhaps the political capital required to leverage that effort in order to patch the most important vulnerabilities first, whether they're a 0 day or 10 years old.
And this is something that, a lot of times you already know the vulnerabilities that you need to patch, but having somebody else that can look across a broader customer base and be able to say, this is one we see impacting other folks. So better batten down the hatches for this can help hopefully ease that pathway a bit. So Steve, can you talk a bit about what these folks can do to protect their organization moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this goes to the process level, right? We need to look at our business's vulnerability management processes to understand if they are really prioritizing the most important things first. We can't just take a look at the CVS score and go by that 9 times out of 10, because there's more complexity. We have to look at business value, business risk, the opportunities that we want, and the trade-offs that we have to make in order to patch vulnerabilities. So being able to establish a program that can take a look at all of these dimensions of your business to understand which risks to mitigate first, I think is really important. All right. Well, Ben, thanks so much for going through the quarterly threat report for Q2 with me. I always enjoy looking at these, and having this conversation with you has been great. I hope everyone who's listening had a great time as well, and that you learned something. If you'd like to know more, you can find the quarterly threat report on our website, and there's some other contact information here on the slide in case you'd like to contact us.
Thanks, everybody.